Hi, welcome along to ArsenalFanTV, and this is a special video about Unai Emery. If you don't know who he is, I don't know where you've been. He is the new manager of Arsenal Football Club. At least it's going to be announced later on this week. Got a text earlier on from David Ornstein, said it's definitely happening, so I'm trusting him. And Unai Emery, former Sevilla manager, former PSG manager and Valencia manager, is going to be taking over Arsenal. I've got with me Adam White. Now, Adam White is from Get French Football News. They're the experts. If you check out the website, it's brilliant. They're the experts on French football. And I thought that I'd link up with Adam to find out a bit more about Unai Emery, because a lot of people have been saying, not too sure, don't know a lot about him. Other people are saying, yeah, he's done this, he's done that. But you guys, you know him inside out because you would have been, studying him over the past couple of years whilst he's been at PSG. First of all, Adam, is this for you a good appointment for Arsenal?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I think it depends a lot on how his tenure pans out. I don't know that he's the right sort of character for what Arsenal need, because there's, with the way that Wenger's tenure ended, there's a sense that perhaps they need a different type of character. And I think Emery, sort of in terms of personality, is very similar to the way Wenger might, operate in terms of press conferences and the way he might connect with the fans. There's a lot of similarities there. But in terms of his sort of footballing outlook, I think there's a real opportunity for Arsenal to develop under him, for sure. He's a very sort of meticulous coach, very detailed, and spends a lot of time on videos, which didn't necessarily play well with the PSG players. But I think with the Arsenal squad, there's probably a chance for a little bit more of a receptive audience. So I think he's definitely a very, very good coach. Whether he is the right man for the role is another question. But it's definitely an interesting appointment.
Well, how was his time at PSG? I mean, I know he's, this season he's won the treble. So, I mean, you look at it on the surface of it, you say, well, you can't get much better than that. But still, they were slightly disappointed with him. I mean, in general, in the whole time he was there, how did he get on? Because he won a lot of trophies, didn't he?
He absolutely did win a lot of trophies. In 2 years, 5 trophies, a league title, 4 cups. In fact, no one's won a cup in France for the last 8 editions apart from PSG. But you're right, it's definitely tinged with disappointment. I think PSG are a club obsessed with winning the Champions League. It's the reason QSI bought them in the first place, and it's basically been their only goal since they sort of won their first domestic treble, which was, 4 years ago now. Perhaps they've won 3 of the last 4 that's happened. So there isn't necessarily much change under Emery. He was brought in because he won those 3 Europa League titles with Sevilla, and there was the hope that his European experience and European success would sort of bring the club on in that regard. And that hasn't really, played out. And given that the club is defined by how they do, self-defined by how they do in the Champions League, there's a sense that it really is a bit of a failure, because, you look at their exits from the Champions League in his 2 seasons, the remontada at Barcelona, the 6-1, was pretty...
They were a bit unlucky with and you've got to say, the first leg, he destroyed Barcelona 4-0. Then in the second leg, I thought they were a bit unfortunate. There's some decisions and that in that game. He was a bit unlucky that year. Yeah,
I would agree with that, certainly. I think, but the only problem is that kind of, it colours his time, doesn't it? It colours his time there. And unlucky or not, the result still came about. And I absolutely agree with you. I think they're extremely lucky. It was 3-1 with 5 minutes to play. So you can't really facilitate for, legislate for that sort of thing. But then there was this opportunity against Real Madrid this year, who, although, yes, they've won the last 2 European Cups and are in the final again, of course, there was a sense that they're not at the peak of their powers, and there was a real opportunity for PSG to at least have some sort of impact on that tie at the very least. And, they were completely outplayed and looked, well out of their level, to be honest. So given that they...
Didn't have Neymar though, did they? That was the big injury. He went into that with an injury as well, didn't he? Sort of the first...
Well, yeah, the missing him for the second leg was very difficult to overcome. But then there's a sense that even with Neymar in the first leg, they didn't make much of an impact on that game. And it felt like that, given the way Laurent Blanc's tenure sort of panned out, they lost to Manchester City, and and a very similar exit, very little changed. And given that's what he was brought in to do, it feels like a bit of a failure.
Yeah, a failure when you win the treble. Please bring that to Arsenal. I'll be happy. But listen, you said he's very meticulous, and we hear stories of him giving giving videos to every player to watch on memory cards and things like that. I mean, how meticulous?
I think I think pretty meticulous. I think you mentioned that instance with the memory cards. There was a situation at Valencia where he'd give effectively homework, USB sticks for players to go home and watch, their sort of video reviews, if you like. And I think, however it panned out with Arsene Wenger, I think defensively, in particular, he'll be studying the way opposition teams play, and the defenders in particular, midfielders, central midfielders in particular, will be very well versed on exactly what to expect from their direct opponents and exactly what to expect from the opposition team. Like I said, I think he uses sort of 12 hours worth of video per match, and then sort of tries to download that into the players' sort of minds, if you like. And he really sees that as an extremely important area of his management. Unfortunately, it kind of feels like he's a little bit defined by it. And I think sort of Joaquin, who played for him at Sevilla, said, he's so obsessed with football, it's virtually an illness. And I definitely think there's a situation where that might be sort of semi-true, but it's difficult to say where else, his sort of personality and his football outlook comes into play. Perhaps that's a little bit. He's not the biggest man manager, the biggest man motivator, which perhaps has come back to bite him. But in terms of detail and football understanding and tactical awareness, he's really up there.
Now, when you say that, I look on it and I say that's one of the areas where last season Arsenal seemed to lack. It seems like in a lot of games, it's almost like we didn't have a plan. It's almost like we hadn't studied teams tactically. So if that is something that he's going to bring to the table and be very meticulous about, I actually think that's going to be a real asset at Arsenal.
I think it really could be, and I think there's sort of an opportunity. There's been a lot of comparisons with the Manchester United situation under Sir Alex Ferguson, when Ferguson left and David Moyes was a bit sort of after the Lord Mayor's show to some extent. I don't think that's necessarily the case with Arsenal. Perhaps given the way that Wenger's sort of for the last 5-10 years panned out, there's a sense of release and a sense of an opportunity to move on, perhaps, and the players might be more receptive to Unai Emery's very detailed approach when perhaps they hadn't experienced it under Wenger, and maybe even players were thinking that they needed that. So where Wenger was perhaps a little bit one-dimensional in certain instances, I don't think you'll get that from Unai Emery. You look at the difference between his Sevilla team and his PSG team. Very counter-attacking at Sevilla, 4-2-3-1, whereas PSG was very possession-based and 4-3-3. So I think he'll pick the right formation and the right players that suit the squad, and they'll definitely see a lot of variation there.
What's he like in defensively? Because again, that's been an area of Arsenal that's been very, very weak, especially over the past season. So easy to score against Arsenal. Is he the sort of manager who will make sure those areas get strengthened up? Absolutely,
and I think that's really characterised his time at PSG. You look at, I think when Arsenal played PSG last season at the Emirates, was it 2-2 draw, I seem to remember, and he sort of prioritises sort of the defensive outlook, and I seem to remember him using Blaise Matuidi as a left winger because he felt it was more defensive to cover that left-hand side rather than a more attacking option. And you look at the players that he's brought through. Presnel Kimpembe is arguably PSG's best centre-back these days, and that's almost entirely down to Emery. His positional awareness is really good, very good at covering, very quick, and it's credit to Emery to bring players like that along. So I think, yes, they'll be very well organised, they'll be very well designed as a defence, if you like, and I think that there's a definite step up in terms of defensive organisation and perhaps defensive outlook from Wenger to Emery.
The other thing that I've read a lot about is that, and you just sort of touched on it, that he's good at developing players. He's good at bringing through, he gets the best out of players, he brings through young players. So you're saying you saw that at PSG? Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's probably really sort of influenced his appointment, because he's a type of manager that will look to favour youth, and I think obviously that's something that's in Arsenal's DNA, of course. And even over the 2 years that he was in charge of PSG, I mentioned Kimpembe at the back, and Adrien Rabiot's come on leaps and bounds, although missed out on the French squad pretty harshly in my opinion, but he's been really, really good. That you mentioned the 4-0 in the first leg against Barcelona. He was amazing in that game, and that's partly down to Emery's tutelage, if you like. Giovanni Lo Celso made the Argentinian squad this week, I think, and he's really come on leaps and bounds under Emery, and I think that given that he may not have as many, he might not have as much resources to work with as Arsenal. He's definitely not going to have the resources of PSG, that's for sure, at Arsenal.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that kind of feeds into his outlook, which makes the PSG appointment a little bit odd, because they're not a club that look into the long term, whereas Arsenal are, and I think that's the kind of outlook that Emery has.
And another thing about Emery that I think Arsenal fans will like is that he can be pretty animated on the touchline. He's not an Arsene Wenger that just sits down and plays with his zip, is he? He's someone he will be on that touchline, won't he?
Yes, he will. He'll definitely he'll be a presence on the touchline, which is odd because in press conferences he's not the most animated. His English is by no means perfect yet, and it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over the course of his tenure. But yeah, definitely will be very noticeable on the touchline for sure.
So he's a bit like Antonio Conte on the touchline, that sort of person.
Yeah, that's a good analogy actually, a good similarity. Yeah, very very similar in that respect. Yeah.
What are they saying about in France? About this appointment? Are they saying that they think it's a good one?
Well, I think that there's a sense that Unai Emery's time at PSG was coming to an end, and there's a sense in France that perhaps he was unfortunate the way that we mentioned previously with those defeats in the Champions League, and there's also a sense that he is a very, very good coach. But there's also a sense in France that he's made mistakes, and there's particular examples with man management in particular that have really influenced his time at PSG, and there's a sense that although he's moving to a different club and a different situation, whether he can overcome those failings, if you like, whether he can will be huge in terms of how it pans out. You look at perhaps Thiago Silva, who's been obviously he's been a very, very prominent player over the last 10 years or so, captain, really trailed off, and there was a sense that, there's a feeling that Emery was going to replace him at the end of last season, but he opted out of doing that because of the sort of the player pressure at the squad, the player power at the squad. In the squad with the Brazilian contingent, he felt that maybe that was too much rocking the boat. So there's instances like that where perhaps it's been a little bit of a weak man management situation, and I think it's whether he can overcome those failings that will sort of colour his time at Arsenal.
Despite that, he's and having to manage those big egos and wars between Neymar and Cavani and things like that, he's still managed to wrestle back the league from Monaco and to win the treble. So he's not exactly going out as a manager with his head down. He's been sacked, isn't it? He's got out on a high, hasn't he?
No, there is still a certain level of respect, I think, for him, absolutely, because like I said, he's such a good coach. The thing with the Monaco situation that you mentioned there is that Monaco work in a very different way, and they sold so many of their players last summer, making sort of 300 million euros or so. They weren't really expected to challenge this year, and PSG were very much expected to regain their title and do so comfortably. So although he's definitely not going out on a low, it's still not the high that they would have hoped by any means. Yeah.
Now, finally, what about Wenger? Because obviously you're over in France. What about Wenger? How have people in France looked at this whole situation with Wenger and the fact that he wasn't sacked, but you can see that he didn't really want to leave. They've asked him to go, and they've sort of given him a grand exit sort of thing. But what have people in France made of it? Did they think it was the right time for Arsene Wenger to go?
I think there's a huge level of respect for Arsene Wenger in France. What he achieved may have sort of fallen away from sort of significance here, a little bit more prominence perhaps in the first 10 years at Arsenal, which really was quite incredible, of course, and there's still a lot of respect for that in France, and he's seen as a brilliant coach and an innovator, of course. So yeah, I think there's definitely a sense that this was the right time for him to go, and I think that's been the way for quite a while. But I don't think his reputation is as tarnished here as it is in France as it is here. So,
and one more thing actually I've got to ask you about, and that's Lacazette. Now Lacazette, he didn't make the French squad. Actually, the first time I think I saw the other day, they say the first time a French player, or first time French players playing under Wenger, or Wenger when he was at Arsenal, that there was no Arsenal French players in that French team. Over here, we were a bit surprised that Lacazette didn't make it. He did have that sort of injury problem, but he recovered well from that, and we're very surprised that he didn't make it. I mean, what's your take on it?
Well, I think there are a number of things that sort of colour this. It is odd. I think personally that Lacazette should be in the squad, but there's Didier Deschamps' outlook on his squad selection has always been a little bit controversial. He has his favourites for sure. Look at Moussa Sissoko's inclusion quite recently against form and against opinion. And that I don't think he really fancies Lacazette. I think he thinks he's got some strikers in Olivier Giroud, who is definitely one of his favourites. Yeah, and you look at his international record, and it's 30 in 71 games. It's pretty good at international level, and he's got Mbappe and Griezmann. It was the sense that perhaps there wasn't space for Lacazette in the squad. He has made the reserves list. There is always, that sense that he's the next man in line, if you like. And I think that the way his Arsenal career's panned out, perhaps injury did affect his chances, because he hasn't got the opportunity. He's never really got the opportunities with France. That given the way he played with Lyon, he was brilliant for Lyon last year, and he's still got a decent goal record for Arsenal this year, and he's never really got the opportunity. So I think that's more Deschamps' preference than Lacazette's poor or perceived poor form.
And give us one or at least two players, right? Because seeing as this sort of transfer season, two players over in France that you think Arsenal should be going for.
Wow, very interesting. So I would say a centre back. And if you're looking sort of at the young sort of French developing route, there's a fantastic centre back at Toulouse called Issa Diop, who's very likely to leave there this summer, and is their captain, only 21, and he's a very sort of tall, rangy, powerful centre back, and has been really, really good recently. Might not be an option for the immediate future, but I would definitely be looking at him. And if I was Arsenal, the place to look for players, I think, definitely given the sort of overlapping philosophies, if you like, is Lyon, and they've got an extremely exciting young team. And you look at Nabil Fekir, if Arsenal can afford him, which I imagine they probably could. He's really come on leaps and bounds this season after a terrible knee injury, which looked to completely end his career almost.
He used to have a great partnership with Lacazette as well, didn't he?
Absolutely, and I think that's something that would really play well at Arsenal too, especially with the Aubameyang's arrival. And I think it's a situation where you would kind of have to build the team a little bit around him, given his position. He's an out-and-out number 10. You couldn't really play him wide, so there'd have to be a little bit of a situation with a change there. But I think he's at the right time to move, unlike players like Malcolm, which Arsenal were linked with quite strongly. I think he needs another season in France. And the other one I would look at is Hossam Aouar, who's a central midfielder, very sort of in the Iniesta mould, who's come through this season. He's only 19, but absolutely unbelievably talented. For Lyon too, he's centre midfielder. He's been absolutely brilliant this season.
No defensive midfielders over there. We're desperate, man. No one.
Arsenal are going to sign William Carvalho at some point. It keeps being mentioned, doesn't it? It's got to happen soon.
I'm fed up hearing that William Carvalho name now.
You could go for Luka Toussaint, who's Lyon captain, another young Lyon player. Sits in front of the defence really well, played for the France under-20s last summer and has been absolutely brilliant for them this season. I mean, he would slot straight in there for me. So I think there are a lot of options. It's a league that's designed to develop players, and Lyon are the place to look at the moment for those players.
And Unai Emery, you'll know all of them because, he'll have his... video analysis on all those players from his time in France. And I really appreciate you coming on today. Once again, just let everybody know where they can get more of your brilliant content.
Yeah, so the Twitter account, which is @GFFN, and the website getfrenchfootballnews.com. Loads of feature pieces and opinion and news about French football.